Why does God allow suffering? In part 2 of this series, we began to explore how suffering can feel overwhelming, how it can leave us feeling lost, broken, and far from God. But we also know that suffering is not without purpose. Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us that God is always working for the good of those who love Him, even when we can't see the full picture. And there's hope beyond the suffering. That hope, promised to us by God, transcends the temporary pain and assures us that this world's suffering is nothing compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. But before we get to that glorious future, there's another important aspect of suffering that we need to address. You see, suffering is not only something to endure, it's also something that can grow us, shape us, and transform us. Part 3 of this journey is about seeing suffering as a path to growth. It's about realizing that even in the darkest times, God is using our trials to refine us, to make us stronger, and to prepare us for a greater purpose. I know this idea might seem almost impossible to grasp when you're in the middle of heartache. You may feel like the pain is too much, like it's crushing your spirit, rather than helping you grow. And if that's how you feel right now, I want you to know that you're not alone in those feelings. But I also want to encourage you to stay with me, because as we dive deeper, you'll see how God can use even the hardest trials to bring about a transformation in your life that you never thought possible. Have you ever heard the term refiner's fire? It's a powerful image used throughout the Bible to describe the process of purification and transformation. When a blacksmith wants to mold a piece of metal, they have to place it into the fire. The heat softens the metal, making it malleable, allowing it to be shaped into something useful, something beautiful. But that transformation only happens because of the intense heat. Malachi 3 verse 3 gives us this image of God as a refiner. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Just as gold is purified through fire, God uses suffering in our lives to refine us, to remove the impurities that we can't see ourselves. This refining process is often painful. It can feel like God is turning up the heat in our lives, pushing us beyond what we think we can handle. But just as the refiner never leaves the fire unattended, God is with us in the heat. He's watching over us, making sure that we are not consumed by the flames, but rather transformed by them. You may be feeling the heat of the fire right now. You may be asking, why does it have to hurt so much? But consider this. Growth rarely happens in comfort. It's the challenges, the trials, the moments that push us to our limits that often produce the most significant change. James 1 verses 2 through 4 tells us, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This verse isn't saying that we should enjoy suffering itself. It's saying that we can find joy in what suffering produces in us. It's through the fire that we develop perseverance. It's through the fire that we become mature, complete, and prepared for the plans God has for us. Think back to some of the hardest times in your life, the moments where you were brought to your knees, where you felt like you couldn't go on. Now look at who you are today. Chances are those difficult moments have shaped you in ways you never expected. Maybe they taught you resilience. Maybe they deepened your compassion for others. Or maybe they drove you closer to God in ways that you hadn't experienced before. The Apostle Paul understood this transformation well. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 through 10, Paul shares a powerful insight. "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" Paul's perspective is counterintuitive to everything the world teaches us about strength. We're told that strength comes from self-reliance, from being independent and unshakable. But here Paul flips that on its head. He says that true strength, real, lasting strength, comes not from our own abilities, but from our willingness to surrender to God, especially in the midst of our weaknesses and trials. It's in those moments of suffering, when we feel weak and broken, that we experience God's power in ways we never could have otherwise. Suffering strips away our illusions of control. It reminds us of our dependence on God, and it invites us into a deeper relationship with Him. It's through our pain that we come to understand God's grace in new and profound ways. One of the most remarkable things about suffering is that God doesn't just use it to refine us. He also uses it to prepare us for something greater. Romans 5 verses 3 through 4 tells us, "Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope." This isn't just abstract theology. It's real, lived experience. God has a plan for your life. And often, the very thing that feels like it's breaking you right now is the thing He will use to prepare you for that plan. The suffering you're going through today may be the training ground for the purpose He has set for you tomorrow. In the Bible, we see this over and over again. Think about Joseph. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years, it seemed like his life was nothing but one long string of suffering and misfortune. But through it all, God was preparing Joseph for a greater purpose. He wasn't just refining Joseph's character. He was positioning him to become a leader who would save nations. Genesis 50 verse 20 shows Joseph's powerful understanding of this. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Could it be that your current suffering is preparing you for a purpose beyond anything you can imagine? Could it be that God is using this season to mold you into someone who will impact others, who will bring hope to those facing their own struggles? You may not see it now, but in time you'll be able to look back and see how God was weaving a beautiful story out of your pain. As we close out part 3 of this series, we've seen how suffering, as painful as it is, can lead to growth, transformation, and preparation for a greater purpose. But there's one more crucial piece of this puzzle that we'll dive into in part 4, the eternal perspective. Because while suffering refines us and shapes us in this life, there's an even greater truth waiting for us. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 17 says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." In part 4, we're going to explore what it means to hold on to hope, not just for today, but for eternity. We'll dive deep into the promises God gives us about what's to come, about how our suffering in this world will one day give way to unimaginable joy in His presence. So as we move forward, remember this. Your suffering is not the end of the story. It's a chapter in a much larger narrative, one that leads to something far greater than you could ever imagine. Keep walking, keep trusting. God is with you every step of the way. And if you haven't yet invited Jesus into your life, I encourage you to do so now. He's the one who turns ashes into beauty, who brings light into the darkest places, and who promises that one day every tear will be wiped away.